You see it in the news all the time, right? War. And whenever you do, you might hear this old, kind of cynical idea pop up that, as horrible as it is, war is actually good for business. But is there any truth to that? Well, today we're going to dive into the data and find out.
So yeah, that's the big question we're tackling. Is war good for the economy? I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? All that devastation, how could it possibly create jobs or boost output? But you'd be surprised how often this idea comes up. This quote right here, it just nails the myth we're looking at. It's this idea that, okay, yeah, the human cost is horrific, we all get that, but maybe, just maybe, there's a financial silver lining. The argument is basically that a country can go to war and somehow end up richer. All right, so to figure this out, we've got to understand where this idea even comes from in the first place. So let's start by looking at the arguments for the myth. Let's give it a fair shake. And to be fair, there are some historical examples that seem to back this up. It's not totally out of left field. You can point to moments where a country goes to war and it looks like their economy gets a big stimulus. So where does that supposed boom actually come from?
Okay, so here's how the thinking goes. It all starts with the government spending a ton of money, right? We're talking soldiers, weapons, all the gear. And that spending can, in theory, create a whole bunch of jobs and get factories humming. Then there's the innovation piece. Necessity is the mother of invention and all that. The classic example is the atom bomb project during World War II, which, believe it or not, led directly to the development of nuclear power. It's this idea of learning by necessity pushing technology forward.
And this is Exhibit A for the war is good for the economy argument. Just look at that number. During World War II, the U.S. economy grew by a mind-blowing 72%. I mean, wow. This is the example everyone points to. It's such a powerful statistic, it almost feels like case closed, right? But it's not the whole story. Not even close.
Okay, so here's where the whole argument starts to fall apart. It turns out the American experience in World War II, it's a massive outlier. It's not the norm at all. And the reason why comes down to one single, absolutely crucial factor. Location, location, location. As in where the war is actually being fought. Just look at this comparison. It tells you everything. On one side, you've got the U.S., which, let's be real, hasn't fought a major war on its own soil since the 1860s. Its factories, its cities, its farms, they were all safe from the bombs. But then you look at the norm, the typical experience. It looks like Ukraine, where the economy just collapsed by nearly a third in the very first year of the invasion. See the difference? For most countries, war means destruction at home, not some kind of production boom happening safely thousands of miles away. So let's put that U.S. outlier case on the shelf for a minute. What does the hard data say about what usually happens to a country's economy during a war? Well, researchers looked at, get this, over 700 wars, going back 2 centuries, to find the answer.
And the answer is pretty brutal. On average, when a country becomes the actual battlefield, its GDP per person drops by 9%. That is a huge economic hit. This is the real, typical cost of conflict. And if that 9% doesn't sound like a lot, let's put it in perspective. We all remember the 2008 financial crisis, right? How devastating that felt? Well, that caused a 4.3% drop in GDP here in the U.S. The average war fought at home is more than twice as destructive economically. We're talking catastrophic. So, why is it so bad? Well, it breaks down into 4 big reasons. First, your workforce gets gutted. People die, others become refugees, and birth rates plummet. Second, your capital stock, that's just a fancy term for all the stuff you need to make things like factories, roads, and farms, it gets destroyed. Third, trade with other countries just stops. Imports and exports totally plummet. And finally, who's going to invest in a war zone? Money flees the country as investors, both at home and abroad, pull out. And this isn't just a temporary dip either. The recovery is just incredibly slow. Get this. A full 25 years after a war ends, half of the economies were still smaller than they were before the fighting started. That's a whole generation. The economic shadow of war is just incredibly long. Okay, but the damage doesn't just stop at the border of the battlefield. The effects ripple outwards. Even for countries like the U.S. that are fighting far from home, or even countries not involved at all, there are major hidden costs. And this is a perfect example of what I mean. Wars are just unbelievably expensive. And how do you pay for them? Usually with debt. You can see it right here on this timeline. America's big conflicts line up pretty clearly with big jumps in the national debt. That money has to come from somewhere, and it usually means borrowing. A lot. And it's not just debt. Look at these other costs. On average, a country's debt spikes by 47%, inflation jumps by about 8%. Even the neighbors get hit. Their economies shrink by 10% on average. And of course, you get these huge shocks to things like oil prices, which then mess with, well, pretty much everyone on the planet.
All right, so it's pretty clear the overall economy takes a massive hit. But what about the stock market? That's a big part of the myth, right? The idea that even if things are bad for the country, some clever investors can make a killing. So is that true?
Well, if you look at how the U.S. market has performed during its big wars, there's just no pattern. I mean, none at all. It went down during World War I, up during World War II, was kind of flat for Vietnam, and took a nosedive after 9/11 before eventually coming back. Sure, maybe some specific defense stocks do well for a bit, but this idea that war is some kind of predictable jackpot for the stock market as a whole, history just doesn't back that up.
So, we've looked at the evidence, we've seen the one big outlier case, and we've seen what the data says usually happens. I think it's time we bring it all together and give a final verdict on that big question we started with.
Let's just recap the whole journey here. The myth starts with a simple idea. War is good for the economy. And the proof is always the US in World War II. But then comes the big pivot, realizing that the US is a total outlier because the fighting wasn't happening at home. And the reality, based on tons of data, is that for almost everyone else, war is economic ruin. So that leads us to a pretty straightforward verdict.
And this quote really says it all. Look, can you cherry pick some positives? A short-term GDP bump here, a defense stock going up there? Yeah, sure. But when you zoom out and look at the whole picture, the mountain of debt, the soaring inflation, the physical destruction, the long-term damage, the conclusion is pretty clear. The idea that war is good for business is, for the most part, a total myth.
And you know, that leaves us with one last really important question. If war is so economically devastating for almost everyone involved, well, then it forces us to look past simple ideas like it's all about the money. It makes you ask, what are the real, complex, and often tragic reasons that nations go to war in the first place? And that is definitely something to think about.